Well, good morning to all those joining us in the United States, and a very good evening to friends and colleagues in South Asia. My name is Akriti Vasudeva Kalyankar, a fellow in the South Asia program at the Stimson Center. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to the capstone presentations of our 2022 cohort of visiting fellows based on their research during a year-long stint with the Stimson Center South Asia program. Since 1993, the South Asia program has hosted a cohort of fellows from India and Pakistan to conduct a research project exploring security issues in Southern Asia and the role of U.S. policy annually. The fellows gain exposure to how Washington, D.C.'s policy community views the region during 2 months in residence at the Stimson Center. They conduct independent research and build networks and connections across the border for deliberative and long-term engagement. Over the past 3 decades, our community of 126 fellows have gone on to serve in government, work in think tanks, or have become influential journalists and strategic commentators. And I wanted to say for this class, particularly, we were enthused that this happened to be an all women cohort of scholars, which I think is excellent for diversity and representation. So today, our visiting fellows will present their work that critically examines the importance of the Indian Ocean to the US Indo-Pacific strategy, the need for a Washington focus on infrastructure development in South Asia's smaller countries, and a path forward for Afghan refugees that relies on US Pakistan cooperation. And to do that, let me welcome our cohort of 2022 visiting fellows. I'm delighted to be joined by Rushali Saha. Rushali is a senior research associate at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research in New Delhi, and her memo explored the role of the importance of the Indian Ocean to US foreign policy, and she'll dig more into that in the presentations later. Riya Sinha is an associate fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress in New Delhi, and her memo examines the geostrategic and geoeconomic potential of smaller South Asian countries, why the United States should prioritize the region for infrastructure financing, and how it can collaborate with India on this topic. Nurulain Naseem is a research associate at the Islamabad Policy Research Institute, and her research for Stimson argued for U.S. Pakistan cooperation in effectively managing refugee inflows, preventing security risks, and enhancing stability through policy coordination, legal frameworks, humanitarian aid, and strategic partnerships. I did want to mention that unfortunately our fourth visiting fellow, Namra Nasir, wasn't able to join us today due to a scheduling conflict, but her research focuses on exploring a US-Pakistan relationship based in non-security collaboration, and we're hoping to publish her paper soon and hope that you all will give it a read. So this conversation will be a moderated discussion. It will involve interaction among the panelists themselves, and of course, plenty of engagement with you, the audience. I'll be interspersing questions from all of you throughout the session. So if you'd like to ask our fellows anything, please submit your queries via www.stimson.org/questions. And I'll just ask for our speakers to aim to keep responses to about 3 to 4 minutes so we can get as many questions as possible and have a bit of a back and forth in a conversation. So let's get right into it because we have less than an hour at this point. I just wanted to start with, having maybe each of you lay out the key argument of your policy memo and why it is relevant to US and South Asian policymakers today. So why don't we start with Rushali?
Thank you so much, Akriti. I will take a quick 30 seconds to thank you, Elizabeth, Frank, the entire team at Stimson Center, Uzair, and especially Dr. Christopher Clary, who is my mentor, for a wonderful experience. And it wouldn't have been possible to publish this research without your support. So thank you so much for that. With that, I'll quickly delve into first my motivation behind why I chose this topic. I remember in 2017 when I first read the National Security Strategy, which spoke about the Indo-Pacific. I was very amused to see that it ends at India. So you're talking about an Indo-Pacific strategy, which is supposed to be the integration of Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, but there's no mention of the Indian Ocean. Like it cuts out more than half of the Indian Ocean. The same was replicated in 2019 when we looked at Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. It did change in Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, but even the graphic map that is on the first page of the strategy document clearly shows what Washington's definition of the Indo-Pacific is. So, being a scholar of Indian Ocean security for a while, and especially in looking at India's approach towards the region, Chinese maritime activities in the region have been happening for a long time, and it's getting increasing attention. So, an Indo-Pacific strategy, which is talking about China and which is talking about increasing India's capabilities to counter China, does not mention the Indian Ocean, is something which is very intriguing to me. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to sort of like delve into why this is happening and make a case for why Indian Ocean needs to be strengthened within the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States. So essentially, my argument is that US needs to look at the Indian Ocean beyond the South Asia frame and look at the region as an integrated whole. And for this, I go into the importance of Indian Ocean. I look at Chinese activities in the region to make the case as to why US cannot afford to ignore the Indian Ocean region. My policy recommendations essentially also revolve around the same, where I argue for United States to give more diplomatic representation in the Indian Ocean littoral countries. I talk about creating institutional links between India and the United States to have a more effective presence in the Indian Ocean region, which I strongly believe will is in fact an important theater for US China competition, and will become even more important. And within that, I also think that the littoral states will have a strong say in shaping how this will play out, because the bipolar competition, so to speak, is playing out in a much more multipolar world today. So I believe they will have a greater say. So therefore, it is very important to have their representation in Indo-Pacific focused platform, which is also another policy recommendation that I make. And apart from that, I also talk about the need to integrate Africa, and especially the eastern coast of Africa, within the Indo-Pacific strategy more holistically. So this is what I essentially looked into, and I'm glad that I got a chance to publish my policy research with the Stimson Center.
Thank you so much, Roshali. That was a really comprehensive overview of your paper, and I have a couple of follow-ups for you. But before we get to that, I want to invite Ria to talk a little bit about her argument and her research.
Thank you, Akriti, and I would echo Rushali in thanking the Stimson Center team for this wonderful opportunity. We got a lot of inputs, a lot of research insights through this fellowship, and I'm truly grateful for what this fellowship was about and the opportunities that it has brought for all of us after. My policy memo focuses on infrastructure financing in South Asia, particularly focusing on a case of US India cooperation in this region. Now, connectivity through infrastructure development, infrastructure financing is not only a geostrategic or a geoeconomic tool, but it is also a policy priority for growth and development for many of the smaller South Asian countries in the region. And when I say smaller South Asian countries, I mean it economically in size and economically as well as geographically, just in terms of the size. There are many studies that present how much of an infrastructure investment the South Asia as a region needs, and it amounts to about $6.3 trillion in climate adjusted infrastructure investments, spanning across sectors such as energy, transportation, hydropower, water and sanitation, etc. And South Asian countries at this point face domestic as well as regional and geostrategic challenges in meeting a lot of these needs. And therefore, this presents an opportunity for both India and US, both who are like minded partners, to invest in infrastructure development in transparent and sustainable terms. What I do in my policy memo is I map the existing US investments in the region. I make a case for why US and India should consider this region important, and I come out with 3 parameters on why this is important. First of all, on the economic growth of South Asia. Second, in light of China's increasing engagements in the region. And third, to also engage India as a regional partner. I then go on to then addressing challenges and identifying some and putting forward some policy recommendations, some a little technical in nature, on how this financing, on what mechanisms can be done, can be used to finance this infrastructure. And this includes from a policy side of using minimum criteria to for infrastructure projects, to also investing in, say, top up financing instead of financing a large infrastructure project together, because it is not possible for every country to match dollar for dollar what China is doing in the region. And therefore, it is important to focus on relative strengths that US and India can bring to the region. And by doing this, doing this is not only important for regional stability, but also for having economic prosperity in the South Asian region. So this is the whole crux of my policy memo, and I'm happy to answer the follow-up questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ria. We'll finally come to Noor. Noor, I hope your internet connection holds. Let us know if not, but over to you to discuss a little bit about your policy memo.
Thank you very much for introducing us so generously, Akriti. I can't believe we're officially at the end of this wonderful fellowship with our final output being published. Yes, I hope the internet connection holds. So, yes, my policy memo basically tries to highlight the value in continued cooperation between Islamabad and Washington, D.C. in terms of the byproducts of Afghan conflict, which primarily include Afghan refugees, the humanitarian crisis, the border security situation, and also the transnational terrorist organizations, including TTP and ISK, which are quite resurgent and have gained unbelievable operational momentum since the withdrawal of 2021 and subsequent takeover of Taliban of Kabul. I believe that it's not a very popular topic in Islamabad or in Washington, D.C. right now, particularly last year. There was a lot of like institutional lethargy in both policy centers, that, oh, but we have withdrawn for good in DC and in Islamabad. Haven't we heard enough of Afghanistan? We fenced the borders. So hopefully a lot of what is happening in Afghanistan will be contained in Afghanistan. But we have seen very clearly that none of the foreign policy goals of the US, which were mentioned quite clearly in the Doha Agreement, none of the foreign policy goals, particularly security related, of Pakistan or even the regional states have been met. In fact, the humanitarian crisis on ground is deepening. It's the treatment of women and young girls at the hands of Taliban and the former U.S. allies is beyond depressing, and the refugee flows towards Pakistan continue despite the fact that Pakistan is going through a severe constitutional crisis of its own, and also its economy is experiencing a growth rate of less than 1%. So basically, I try to not really advocate for an increased cooperation, but at least pursuing an efficiency-based cooperation. If the U.S. is not ready, quite understandably, to increase the funding or assistance to Pakistan and Afghanistan operations, at least what it can do is that make sure that its taxpayers' money, where it's deployed in over-the-horizon CTO operations, in refugee management, in Expata, that is the Afghanistan border terrain, whose rehabilitation U.S. has extensively invested in. At least these operations should give the return on investment to U.S. as a major donor of humanitarian aid, refugee operations, and also a major CTE partner, because transnational terrorism is definitely an international security concern. So this is pretty much what I was trying to do in DC last summer. I learned so much from my fellow VFs. I can't believe that we don't have Namra here. She was such a wonderful company. And I don't think that this memo could have this much value for its readers had I not been in contact with my Indian counterparts and also Namra and each and every one of you from the Stimson team. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Noor. And we'll get a little bit more into this question of political will and political feasibility in our next round of questions. But maybe a couple of follow-ups that I had for each of you. So Rishali, first to you. You mentioned the importance of the U.S. engaging the Indian Ocean, particularly the littoral states. We have seen some of this come through in the last few years, right? Particularly if you look at the Biden administration's efforts with regard to stepping up engagement with Maldives or Sri Lanka. How do you see that in the context of the U.S., broader Indo-Pacific strategy? Scholars like Nilanthi Samranayake have spoken about how the U.S. Policymakers still view the Indian Ocean primarily through a South Asia lens, and I believe you mentioned that as well at the top of your comments. Have you seen some of the recent kind of actions and developments break out of that mold?
Right. Thank you so much for that question, Akriti. Indeed, as I pointed out during my remarks, it was quite positive to see the Biden administration rectify in many ways by expanding the definition of the Indo Pacific in its strategy document and explicitly mentioning that it includes the entire Indian Ocean. However, in my assessment, I do believe it is still not sufficient. And since you mentioned Maldives, let me point out that since 2020, there's been talks of U.S. establishing its diplomatic presence and establishing an embassy in in Maldives. And I think in 20, it was the target was supposed to be end 2022, early 2023, but that has still not happened. Meanwhile, Maldives has reopened its embassy in Washington. There have been indicators which show that there is renewed interest, and especially in the Congress as well, there has been a lot of discussions, there's been a lot of hearing. But in terms of like action, it translating into action, I do see there's still limited effort or sort of like actionable moves towards the same. And this I believe is because still, as you correctly said, Nilanthi has also spoken about this a lot, is there is a tendency to view the Indian Ocean separate from the larger Indo-Pacific strategy, right? So the focus is more on the Pacific, which is understandably so also because it has defense commitments, it has allies in the region. But I think it's important to highlight here that developments which are happening in the Indian Ocean will inevitably affect what is happening in the Pacific as well, both in offensive and in defensive operations as well. So yes, I think the positive aspects, coming back to that, is I do see there's a renewed focus on non-traditional security issues from the US. So the US has been engaging with Maldives, with Bangladesh, with Sri Lanka on maritime domain awareness and on more broadly on regional maritime security. But still, it is noteworthy that not like many of the Indian Ocean littoral countries still don't have representation in IPEF, and I think they would benefit greatly from the IPEF. And while US has made concerted efforts to include Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, it has not engaged with the African littorals that I spoke about earlier as well in bringing them under the IPEF framework. And again, coming to Sri Lanka, which I believe you mentioned as well, where I see it to be more of a politically charged relationship and more developments happening, of course, along the lines of talking about democracy and human rights, but the economic angle of it is still missing. US investment when it comes to port infrastructures in these countries is limited. When it comes to integrating them within the regional maritime security paradigm larger is still limited. So I believe a lot more needs to be done, but I do identify more momentum and more awareness on the importance of Indian Ocean and engaging with these littorals, and also more positively ties with India have been strengthened. And I think from New Delhi, there is a more positive view of American presence in the Indian Ocean, which is a very good starting point for the two countries to work together to increase US benign presence, if I can put it that way, in terms of providing development cooperation aid and sort of like, more Coast Guard cooperation and really responding to what the countries need. There is more scope for in the current administration, but I do believe a lot more needs to be done.
Thank you so much, Rojali. And I remember the conversation about 6 to 8 years ago about lack of sort of an operational overlap between the U.S. and Indian, geographic definition of the Indo-Pacific, or even the focus on the Indian Ocean. That conversation has definitely advanced over the last few years. So that is a positive development. Coming to you, Ria, you have a lot of experience conducting field work in the region. You have looked at various, border connectivity and infrastructure projects, and you've seen sort of involvement of other actors in the region as well, besides the U.S. So I wanted you to maybe reflect on how would you, compare and contrast the engagement of, say, Japan or Australia to that of the U.S. in infrastructure development in South Asia, and what do you think recent successes that India's had in the region in terms of border connectivity and infrastructure mean for its collaboration with all of the Quad partners?
Thank you, Akriti. I think if you're comparing the investments or the engagements by partners such as Australia, US, and Japan in the region, it needs to be compared in terms of the quantum of engagements, the financing, and the development that has happened. I mean, in terms of my own experience, fieldwork, and speaking to people in New Delhi, Japan is much ahead of Australia and United States in this regard. Earlier this year, when Japanese Prime Minister he announced a new plan for free and open Indo-Pacific, the agenda for connectivity itself was expanded from just infrastructure development and financing to creating industrial value chains, and thereby really enhancing the sustainable aspect of it by focusing on investments and industries to drive the growth and development. With Japan, I think there are also institutional mechanisms that focus on connectivity and cooperation with India, such as the Act East Forum, for example. There's also the Bay of Bengal Industrial Growth Belt Initiative, which is also known as the Big B, that Japan is spearheading in the region, and Bangladesh has shown a lot of inclination to join Big B as an initiative. Additionally, it's also bringing what Japan is doing here. It's also bringing best practices and success stories from Southeast Asia, such as the Southern Economic Corridor, to really spearhead the development in infrastructure development, financing, cross-border infrastructure, multimodal connectivity in the region. Now, compared to Japan's engagements, Australia is a relatively new player. In early 2000, in early 2002, I think Australia announced a commitment of about $36 million dollars for disaster preparedness, trade competitiveness, and development. And in a region that it calls Northeast Indian Ocean or the Bay of Bengal region, which does include 5 countries of South Asia, and it also is focused on development in the region. So I would say that US engagements lie somewhere between that of Japan and Australia. US has been present in the region for a long time. USAID, for example, has been one of Nepal's oldest development partners, but it has mainly been working towards strengthening democracy or promoting inclusiveness. In India, USAID has had investments in the energy sector, but all of that is changing right now. In Bangladesh, also the focus has been on democracy, and in Sri Lanka and the peace process historically. But all of this is changing with with the coming of agencies such as the DFC, or USAID is also expanding its mandate, the MCC as well. So this is changing the focus of how the Quad partners, all these countries, are coming into the region. Now, you mentioned about India's success stories and how that is enhancing collaborations. See, in the last decade, for sure, India has had a huge success in connectivity. There were historic legacy projects that India has completed in the last 1 decade. Newer infrastructure projects have come up, such as cross border petroleum pipelines, inland waterways transportation. About 10 integrated checkposts have been built, whereas in the 2000s it took 10 years to even build the first checkpost itself. So a lot of developments have taken place, and this is good news for both India, for South Asia, and the development partners, and the Quad partners as well, because they now see India as a reliable infrastructure development partner and financer in the region. Japan, for example, when it released the new free and open Indo-Pacific policy that was done in New Delhi a few months ago. The 2002 Indo-Pacific policy of the United States also says India, also calls India like-minded partner and a regional leader in South Asia. So without delivering, there would be a lack of trust on India's capabilities itself. So delivery is very important in this regard, and I think this is bringing all the Quad partners together in the region for development.
Thanks, Rian. I think it's really important that the Quad countries are actually responding to the needs of the countries in the region, and having more of a dialogue about what projects make sense, and what collaboration mechanisms make sense, which is definitely an improvement on how things have been over the last few years at least. So thanks for that. Noor, coming to you, wanted to dig a bit deeper into that question of, political will, as we were kind of talking about, especially, cognizant of the fact that Pakistan is currently undergoing its own domestic challenges, both economically and politically. wanted to ask you, since you're on the ground and having these conversations, how salient is the public and policy conversation in Pakistan right now on Afghan refugee management, considering there are so many other issues to deal with domestically? And how could Pakistan's relations with the Taliban regime, which have been particularly tense over the last few months, impact how Afghan refugees are viewed going forward?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I absolutely agree with you that there's very little political will in Islamabad to take a look at any political situation just because of the fact we actually have an interim government and we're pretty much delaying the much awaited elections. Also, the fact that Pakistan is an underdeveloped state that has been sustaining around 3.5 to 4 million Afghans for over 4 decades. It's quite logical, if not moral, that there is an overall lethargy inside Pakistan also. That because I think every host state, unfortunately, 80% of the global refugee situations are hosted in underdeveloped states because most of them share international borders with the conflict zone. So, yeah, it's pretty obvious that there is a lethargy inside Pakistan policy circles as well, and also inside the communities, mostly the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa KP region, which is Pashtun dominant region and shares borders with Afghanistan. Also, around 60 to 70% Afghan refugees are Pashtuns. So yes, it's a mix and match situation. The communities are also, if not frustrated, that at least a bit tired of hosting the refugees. At central government level, there are too many frictions happening between the major political parties. We have a constitutional crisis, I've already mentioned. At provincial level, there are more important issues like transnational terrorism alive, how to, elect the local bodies elections that are also delayed. So yes, in middle of that, advocating for a relatively politically powerless, if not inconsequential group like the refugees, it's not very easy. But as policy researchers, I think it is our job to remind the policymakers that just because an issue is not imminent in nature, and just because it is not an internal security issue, does not mean that it is not an issue which is absolutely unworthy of your attention. And also, but I would also like to mention that there have been several times in the last year, in particular, that parliamentarians from ex-Fatah, like Mohsen Dawar, had taken up the floor of the parliament and been very vocal about the fact that Afghan refugees are not being entertained or managed in a just manner, despite the fact that Pakistan's own 2 million kids are out of school. To expect it, with its staggering economy and its troubled borders, to entertain refugees on prima facie basis, it doesn't make a lot of sense or could not be sold very easily to policy circles. The debates are alive. As far as the Pakistani relationship with Taliban are concerned, I think that Pakistan's relationship with Taliban is as complex as the situation or the interdependence that Pakistan and Afghanistan have with each other in terms of trade, in terms of the fact that they share an international border, the fact that the ethnic group of Pashtuns is divided across their border, the fact that Pakistan enjoyed the infamous strategic depth because of the Taliban for so long. So I think that outrightly saying that it's a completely a bad marriage situation which cannot be redeemed is a bit far flung. Taliban are coming more and more on board every day to contain TDP. Only recently they ordered a religious decree under which they have forbidden all Afghan nationals to attack Pakistan territory, particularly Pakistan security forces. They have also shown some flexibility in terms of taking it a little bit easy on the border because previously the border was pretty much on fire. They were targeting Pakistan security forces repeatedly. But the fact that Taliban do not have effective control of the entire Afghanistan, it cannot be expected from them that they will be able to create any kind of political discipline at the center or even provide for the people that they're supposed to take care of, which means that the push factors are pretty much going to be alive and more refugees are going to be coming to Pakistan. And as per my understanding, the previous tripartite agreements between UNHCR, Pakistan government, and the previous Afghan government were the documents that were steering the repatriation of Afghan refugees. But no such agreement has recently been discussed or is anywhere near being signed. It's all happening pretty much ad hocly, particularly after the withdrawal of U.S. forces. Around 600,000 Afghans entered Pakistan. None of them have been issued an asylum certificate by UNHCR, and they're not also or either being entertained under the proof registration card, the POR card that Afghan refugees usually hold. So we're actually at the brink of an acute statelessness, which nobody wants to talk about in Islamabad, in Kabul, or in DC. I hope I answered your question, Akriti.
Thank you so much, Noor. We're already starting to get a lot of audience questions, but if you'd like to ask our panelists something, please go to www.stimson.org/questions to type in your query. And for the next round, maybe I will sort of dig into some of the common themes that I saw throughout your policy memos and maybe intersperse some audience questions as well. We'll probably go in reverse order. So, Noor, I'll come to you first. We've been talking a little bit about, and your memo, specifically makes a case for greater U.S. intervention in Afghanistan and calls for greater U.S. Pakistan cooperation. But this, as we've spoken about, is happening at a time when Afghanistan or Pakistan issues have taken a backseat to great power competition with China and Russia. And there's also, an audience question that I think really kind of plucks at this theme. So Muhammad Mukim Abbas has asked a question on US India Pakistan relations in the context of this. And he asks, as the US increasingly focuses on the Indo Pacific for its strategic interests, there is greater potential for US India multilateral partnership to grow further. But in the midst of all this, how will US approach its relationship and cooperation with its historic non NATO ally Pakistan? Could we be seeing a broader shift in US priorities between the two South Asian rivals?
Okay, so I think I'll take care of the first question that you asked me in context of memo, and then we circle back to Mohammed's question. So yeah, the policy memo, like I did mention initially, does not advocate for increased financial assistance or does not aim to convince the U.S. policy community to completely, reshift their focus from India, for example, or Ukraine, but at least be cognizant of the fact that it is U.S. taxpayers' money that has been allocated under the budget request moved forward by the US administration to the Congress in 2022. And under that budget administration, around 82 million USDs have been allocated for Afghanistan Pakistan operations. And under those operations, the rehabilitation of ex-Fatah region, which means policing reforms, judicial administrative reforms, border management, and also Afghan refugee management, most of the funds of which move through UNHCR operations. The efficiency around these funds should at least be a concern to US policymakers because it is their taxpayers' money. So the memo basically not only tries to highlight the plight with which the Afghan migrants and refugees are going through, because they're pretty much being forgotten by not only the donor states but also the political entity or the group which is supposed to represent them, at least, or majority of them back home. Not only was I trying to make a case on moral grounds or an international humanitarian responsibility towards refugees that the entire globe has, or particularly the US, which has committed so many funds over the years, has remained the largest investor of humanitarian funds in Afghanistan for so many years. Why wouldn't it want the outputs or the return on that investment? So that is basically what I was trying to advocate for. And in order to identify the mechanisms and methods and stakeholder engagement which can help the DC community, attain this goal of efficient funds management or deployment, I come up with a few recommendations. For example, using the desk of refugee coordinator deployed by PRM at state at the US Embassy, who has a lot of political goodwill. DC infamously has a lot of political goodwill or sway in Islamabad policy circles, and also Rawalpindi policy circles, because it is actually the military which is mostly in charge of ex-Fatah border region. And then USAID operations and DoD operations either have directly been responsible of the collateral damages that happened across Pakistan-Afghanistan border, or also the rehabilitation of IDPs and the infrastructure that was destroyed. So I think it's high time that US accounts, and US and Pakistan both account for the mistakes that were made and move forward on need assessment basis, not just historical baggage or repetition of action. Just because a certain amount of fund is always deployed in a certain country or in a region, we're not going to move below a certain category of funds, and we're just going to repeat investing under certain budget heads. So it tries to basically highlight the value that US can have in terms of its investments on refugees, on over the horizon CTE, on expat rehabilitation, or on border management in terms of curtailing transnational terrorists, which have targeted US time and again, and had the ability to kind of engage DC in this infamous Afghan conflict for 2 decades, which costed U.S. economy so much, and U.S. had to withdraw without its foreign policy goals being met. One of the major goals was to contain the transitional terrorist operations and reduce, or at least reduce, if not completely, kill the capacity to engage international targets, particularly U.S. A recent Pentagon report indicates that ISK might engage an international target in US or Europe. So yeah, these were the points that I was trying to make. And again, because it's your taxpayers' money, because the transnational terrorism is alive across the border, we're already investing in refugees, because if Pakistan will not be able to hold them, they will seek illegal routes and opt for third state settlement, which of course US cannot entertain beyond a certain capacity of its own. I think Biden administration promised some 125,000 refugees from across the globe. I mean, it cannot entertain all of them to be Afghans. So yeah, these were basically the points that I was trying to make. And as far as Mohammad's question is concerned, I think, yeah, it's a very valid question. I think there is a lot of insecurity or a lot of apprehension in Islamabad right now, and in also Rawalpindi, given the rapidly and impressively growing defense ties between US and India, especially in the wake of President Modi's visit. The change of status of Kashmir is something that was not very well received in Islamabad as well. But in the meantime, Islamabad has its engagement alive with China, and is likely to engage more with China, which is a strategic counterpart of US and also India. So I think that states do balance power quite well. South Asia, unfortunately, is also a nuclear flashpoint. And if it becomes a casualty of great power competition in the near future, which it unfortunately the state decisions on both sides of the border in Pakistan repeatedly remind us that they are both the states are ever too ready to engage in arms race. Unfortunately, I think we're talking about millions of people who are already struggling with poverty and underdevelopment and underrepresentation, and states being mostly concerned about being entertained under defense deals, either with India or China. I think it's such a shame. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noor. I think you made your case very effectively. Ria, coming to you and sort of digging deeper again into that theme of competing priorities and the question of political will. We've seen that there is a larger focus in the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy now on some of the other neglected regions in the Indo-Pacific, right, such as the Pacific Islands. How would you argue in favor of the importance of infrastructure development in South Asia in such a context? And I think I will probably fold in a question from the audience as well. This is Batsal Newman, who asks how the US can play a role in improving the institutional capacity in smaller South Asian countries when it comes to infrastructure development, beyond just competing with China on filling these investment gaps.
Thank you, Akriti. Certainly, there's so many, like I said initially, that infrastructure development and investment priorities are different for different countries. And one of the realizations when we were in DC was that perhaps South Asia is not a priority area in DC, especially the smaller South Asian countries. So how do we? So one of the focus of the policy memos was also that how do you make the case that South Asia is important too? Not that Pacific Islands are not important, but it's just another region which requires an additional focus and additional collaborations and cooperation mechanisms for growth and development. Now, I would argue for three reasons why South Asia is important, and there's something I highlight in the policy memo also. First is on the economic potential of South Asia. Now, it's been established by multilateral agencies as well, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, that within Asia, the requirement for infrastructure development, for infrastructure financing, is the highest in the South Asian region. Despite this, for years, of course, South Asian region has been registering a higher GDP growth minus the pandemic years. but it's still we also need to look at the potential of additional financing. I mean, if this is the growth rate without having good infrastructure in the region and high logistics costs and higher transportation costs, then imagine what would be the potential of this region when it has good infrastructure financing, when it has robust, sustainable, resilient infrastructure. And this is also important in the sense that when we're talking about moving supply chains away from China, India is, of course, a bigger player, but there are also neighboring countries like Bangladesh that can really add value into reshoring of supply chains. In the absence of this infrastructure development, we also need to be cognizant of the fact that it makes the smaller South Asian countries vulnerable. For example, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh are some of the highest recipients of Chinese loans in the region. And we're all aware of the economic crisis in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, for example. Nepal and Bangladesh are not too far because they also have recent arrangements with the IMF. So in this kind of, in this kind of geostrategic context where we don't want a larger engagements with China or larger influx of China in the region, which does cause anxieties within India, within New Delhi, and also in Washington DC, it is important to support these South Asian countries through their development needs. And there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Like you mentioned earlier, there are national priority projects recognized by each of these South Asian countries, which US and India can tap into. The third reason that I would argue for is that India, when Washington says that India is a like-minded strategic partner in the Indo-Pacific, and India that is deeply invested in its neighborhood itself, because of China, because of any other region, may not be able to be a very valuable and efficient partner in the long run. And therefore, relying just on one country to meet the infrastructure needs of those other South Asian countries or any other financing or fiscal requirements for that matter is not going to be a beneficial way to address the challenges. Now, I don't advocate always for collaboration. Of course, there's a lot of there's a lot of emphasis on how US and India can collaborate. But I would argue also that it doesn't need to collaborate. There doesn't need to be a US India mechanism all the time. Of course, there can be beneficial mechanisms. India and US do have trilateral partnerships in Asia and Africa. But I think coordination of projects is more important in this regard. The MCC, for example, if you deep dive into the projects, they are close to the Indian border, and coordinated mechanism is going to have long-term returns than compared to, say, collaborative projects, which may have terms and conditions that the smaller countries cannot fulfill, for example. To answer Beth's question on how US can play a role in improving institutional capacity, and I take it from the coordination part of it, that it's not enough to just invest in larger infrastructure project. It's not enough to just build the infrastructure. These countries within South Asia also need bureaucratic and institutional capacity building, and that has to be. And if a mechanism can be introduced where a capacity building component, a community development program can be incorporated within the project, I think that is going to have a holistic developmental benefit for these countries, and a standalone infrastructure financing and leaving it to the countries to then operate. I think a little bit of hand holding over there is required. That said, I think the region also needs to be very careful about how both India and US need to be very careful about how they use terms like Indo-Pacific and Quad, because they're not always perceived in very positive terms in the region. The same is happening with BRI, for example. So, I mean, there is a hesitancy in the smaller South Asian countries in sort of going into a US camp with the Indo Pacific or a BRI camp with China. So, I think it's important to have these projects, announce them, coordinate and cooperate for these projects. But it is also important. I think it's not going to be beneficial if we announce the projects, announce something as Indo Pacific and not deliver. Then just delivering on the projects that is going to have a more positive impact in all of these countries.
I think that's a great point, Ria, and particularly on the coordination bit. I think the lesson also from Delhi's experience of working with Tokyo and Sri Lanka, or broadly as well, has been that it's easier to coordinate rather than collaborate because it's hard to harmonize guidelines, procedures, especially when there are existing relationships that these countries already have in the region. So I think that that's a really important point. Rishali, coming to you, wanted to sort of dig deeper into how perhaps your assessments might have changed in light of some of the recent developments with regard to U.S. Posture or thinking on the Indian Ocean. So we've seen the announcement of an inaugural Indian Ocean dialogue between the U.S. and India during Prime Minister Narendra Modi's recent visit to D.C. in June. There have also been, various references by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to the Western Indian Ocean and U.S. interests there. We've also seen greater interest from Washington, for example, in Africa with the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit in December 2021. So, wanted to ask you whether that has changed sort of your perception of U.S. importance to the Indian Ocean, and what are perhaps areas of collaboration between the U.S. and India and Africa more broadly, because Prime Minister Modi has also mentioned that Africa is a priority area in India's foreign and economic policy.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Akriti. I wouldn't read too much into the Indian Ocean dialogue which you were talking about, especially since such platforms have existed, still exist. There is a US India maritime security dialogue which happens regularly, and Indian Ocean issues are discussed quite frequently there. So, what I would be more interested to see, and plus, I think it's a bit too soon to assess. I'm hopeful about the outcome, but I'm curious to see at what level this will be implemented. And one of my policy recommendations, in fact, is about creating greater institutional links between India and US on Indian Ocean. So I'm curious to see whether India's recently announced maritime security coordinator will have dialogue with the Quad security coordinator, and what at what level will that conversation take place is something that I'm looking forward to seeing. But in itself, just conversations do indicate that there is strong, like, greater need for thinking, like both of them are consulting each other on important issues. But I still think that more action needs to be taken. But I am more hopeful about the remarks by Wendy Sherman in Dhaka, which was in the Indian Ocean Conference, actually, where US committed $165 million, and has even asked the Congress for $6 million for Indian Ocean regional maritime security initiatives with Bangladesh, with Maldives, Sri Lanka. Now, that I think is a very positive development, which does indicate that US is thinking more seriously about this region and is looking to partner with India in the Indian Ocean region. So, of course, positive developments have been there, but I do believe that more concerted action is necessary. And I am hopeful that going forward, Indian Ocean will receive more priority within the Indo-Pacific strategy. And as you mentioned earlier as well, that there is a growing awareness. The conversation in the past, I think 3 years or 5 years, has definitely changed, and Indian Ocean is coming up in more and more conversations now. That's definitely a positive development. But I do believe there's more scope for work to be done, and that's where I think Africa comes in now. Historically, if you look at US view of this region, so I think the term that is used, which was used in a diplomatic telegram, I think back in the 1970s, was arc of crisis. So the region in the US is often seen from this lens of arc of crisis, which I still see in many ways does dominate. And that is not to, of course, nullify the efforts which is being done by the African Central Command, which has a very strong reputation. I've had interactions with African scholars who view the AFRICOM presence very positively there, because they've contributed a lot to, in terms of, like, providing humanitarian assistance. The Coast Guard has been active, but we'll still see that US involvement in things like port building, in ship building, is still very limited. In fact, just yesterday, in contrast, India and Kenya signed, Goa Shipbuilding Limited signed an agreement with the Kenya Shipbuilding Corporation for building ships and commercial ships there. And I think that is an area where US has so much domestic experience. The US definitely must come in here and explore this region and explore the prospects of port-led coastal development, which is still missing because right now a lot of activity is happening, but they're mostly focused on issues such as the IUU fishing, which is of course a very important problem. But the economic development, which will truly bring the region out of poverty and lead to overall development, is still missing, and the US can play an important role here. Having said that, also it's important for the US to keep in mind that there are concerns about militarization. So, greater naval presence, so to speak, may not be the way forward. For that, India and US, I think, should take their navy to navy relations, take it a step further and build it into a more comprehensive relationship where there can be greater coast guard collaboration between India and US, which would be a positive way forward for both countries to cooperate. And yeah, I do believe that, as Ria pointed out, that Indo-Pacific is a term which has a lot of apprehensions associated with it. There is very little awareness about what this strategy is about, and there is, in fact, a misperception also about it being against China. If you look at India's vision of the Indo-Pacific, it is not aimed towards countering China. That's why we keep stressing inclusivity. ASEAN centrality is such an important pillar. So it is important to have these conversations with the African countries to explain what the Indo-Pacific is. You spoke about the US and Africa Leaders Summit. It makes no mention of the Indo-Pacific there. With even in India's interactions with Africa, there is no talk about the Indian Ocean. So I feel like if these issues are discussed with African countries more extensively, to just pay more attention to what is it that they need and offer that jointly, would be a good step to work together and go forward.
Thank you so much, Roshali. And let me take a couple more audience questions before we get to our last round here. And I think I'll maybe club two that are related and we haven't spoken about too much. So, one question is from Matthew Kennedy, and he asks about um, China Indian naval competition and Indian Ocean sort of as a theater of competition, your views on that, and a completely sort of opposite question on is there any low hanging fruit that India and China can kind of cooperate on in South Asia? And this question is from Atif Chaudhry.
Right. Thank you so much for that. As far as India and China naval competition is concerned, I think there is much more greater awareness now in New Delhi that China is a real threat in the Indian Ocean. So, for the longest time, when we used to talk about a two-front war in New Delhi or in strategic circles here, it referred to the territorial threat which is coming from China on one hand and Pakistan on the other. But now, when we talk about a two-front war, it talks about how one, if it is a territorial threat from Pakistan along the land borders, it is a threat from China in the Indian Ocean. And this is something which is very concerning in here in New Delhi. Now, India, although it developed its maritime consciousness slightly later, if I may put it that way, because of course it was caught up with territorial concerns in post-independence, Cold War period, but I do believe India has made major strides, especially under the current administration, with Sagar. Sagar, security and growth for all in the region, has been a victory for India in many ways. And this has to do not just in terms of like the diplomatic presence, but even what India is offering. And as Ria also mentioned, that India's reputation as a reliable partner is something that it can really bank on, and is something that it has sort of like further honed over the past couple of years. So India has become, I believe, a much more assertive player in the Indian Ocean. But having said that, China's strategy towards the Indian Ocean, which is something that I go deeper into in my policy memo as well, is it's not just about Chinese military presence, submarine presence, but how China is presenting itself as an alternative to Western countries in the region. Now, this is taking the shape of providing development aid, being involved in port infrastructure projects, and in terms of responding to what these countries want and increasing high level engagements with these countries. So the competition definitely is here to stay, and I do believe that going forward, it will be a major determining factor in terms of how India and us overall competitive relationship evolves. Indian Ocean will be an important arena where this competition is playing out. As far as low hanging fruit is concerned, I believe at this point, India and China ties are at a low, and I am not very optimistic about areas of cooperation. But having said that, I can think of climate change being one area where the two countries can cooperate. Especially, China has made a lot of advances in controlling air pollution, which sitting here from New Delhi, I can assure you, is something that India really needs to think about a bit more seriously. So, if there is, but I don't see it in the current environment scope for cooperation on these lines. But I do believe that a dialogue between the two countries on this issue is something which both sides could benefit from.
Thank you so much, Roshali. And I think you're right that currently there India-China ties are at an impasse because there is such a sort of fundamental disagreement between both sides on what normalization of the relationship actually means and whether keeping the border issue central to the relationship is important or not. And both Delhi and Beijing have very different views on it. And so not too much scope for cooperation in the current kind of political environment. But in our last few minutes, what I wanted to do maybe, and I'll also try to fold in a couple of audience questions, but maybe give you all a little bit of time to reflect on your time in DC, the year long, the 2 months in residence, and the year long fellowship that you had, and wanted to specifically ask you how the fellowship experience and the opportunity that you had to interact with your fellow analysts, whether that has impacted your research approach, and what was your greatest learning from your time in DC about US perspectives on South Asia as a region. Let's start with Ria.
Thank you, Akriti. I think the entire fellowship, as I mentioned before, has been a very enriching and rewarding experience. And of course, I'm grateful to Stimson Center for the opportunity. I've learned so much about asking the difficult question as well from my, fellow fellows who are who are friends today, and we continue to talk. Um, you know, and it's also been a bit of a reality check as well, because when I'm in the South Asian region and I'm researching on the South Asian region, so for me this is very important. But when you move to another region, say Washington DC for example, it was very new to me that perhaps that South Asia is the does not even feature in the top 10 list of priorities for the US right now. And of course, understandably, because of its own interests, so Washington has different priorities. Therefore, it also enabled me to ask some of the difficult questions on how can we make this happen and what are the challenges that we need to be aware of. Because sitting in the region, think in silos sometimes, and it was a great opportunity to come out of that and have experience of conducting research and writing these policy memos. So I'm very grateful to the Stimson Center for this.
Thanks, Ria. Noor?
I would just like to chip into the last question that what is the low hanging fruit for China and India? I think the transnational terrorism ensuing from Afghanistan is definitely something that India has been at the receiving end of, something that the region has to engage with when it comes to a regional dialogue. Unfortunately, there is no regional dialogue right now. The lines of communication are pretty much dead between Islamabad and New Delhi, and also the posture between Beijing and Delhi was pretty apparent in some international conferences that Beijing attended in New Delhi, which is such a shame. And also climate change, very well mentioned. South Asia is worst hit of all the regions across the world. And I think that it's high time that everybody sits together and realizes or banks in the realities other than our arms competition. And also Indian Ocean, both India and China are aspiring leaders of the global South, and both are investing heavily in connectivity infrastructures. And for that, the peace across international borders is absolutely necessary. And because India and China share international border, it's absolutely necessary that there is an ongoing conversation between them on, rather than competing on these connectivity projects, they can definitely converge their interests. Both are energy starved, both are rising economies, both have huge populations that they have to feed. So yeah, in terms of the fellowship, absolutely wonderful. I think that my two recent pieces received in DC, one on arms race and the other on Chinese growing influence in Indo-Pacific, I could not have conceived at all without the knowledge that I learned from all the questions that Ria and Roshali asked in DC Circle. So thank you so much. Me and Ria also did a publication. I mean, I have to give her all the credit because it is her work that I built on with a co-author in Islamabad on the importance of border infrastructure and how they can bring peace and connectivity to the region the way everybody from the team, including yourself and Elizabeth and Frank and everybody, really, I can name everybody, but that will take too much time, mentored us, gave us confidence, and to really know how DC perceives South Asia and how different policy circles inside the larger policy circle of DC perceive South Asia, how the government looks at South Asia, how the DoD looks at South Asia or Pakistan or India, how the INGO community looks at it, how think tank community looks at it, and where basically the conversation or the interests fall out. I think it was such a novel experience. So I definitely thank Stimson, definitely thank the fellow VFs and you. I mean, if I look at my learning curve and the worldview that has expanded since the last summer, it's been remarkable. So I am very humbled by this opportunity and very lucky to get to know all of you and learn from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Noor. Roshali, last word to you on your fellowship experience before we wrap up quickly here.
Thank you so much, Akriti. Thank you, Ria and Noor, for your wonderful remarks. It is indeed quite emotional. I'm so glad I get to see both of you again. But it's just, for me, this fellowship was not just learning about Washington, D.C., but I think I learned so much about Pakistan. Because from the first day, I connected with my fellow VFs from Pakistan over our shared love for Bollywood. Now, this is something that I'd heard about and I'd read about, but just meeting in person and in the very first day, realizing we have so much in common. And it was also very emotional with, like, having sharing our experiences, what I've heard from my grandparents, and connecting over that, discovering shared heritage. And yes, Noor, I know, is smiling because she also has lineage from Calcutta, which is where I'm from. So it's been a very, very emotional experience for me, and this would not have been possible without the Stimson Center visiting fellowship. And yes, as Ria pointed out, it was really a learning experience for us when we went there and realized what goes on in Washington, D.C. And that's when it made me realize. Like, the sort of, like, we've heard about the American dream so much sitting here in Delhi, but once we go there and we understand that US is, it made me realize that it's still a superpower in many ways when, as far as the soft power is concerned. And there's so much that is happening there, like this, like, it was very interesting for me to learn so much about how even the think tanks in DC are working and how actively they're contributing to the policy discourse, which is something very, very positive. And overall, it was a great learning experience. I feel like the team at Stimson made us feel like home. So it was a great time overall, a great learning experience. And yes, I hope to take forward my research on Indian Ocean and talk about the need for more cooperative approaches and the need to really, like, take Indian Ocean more seriously within the Indo-Pacific greater. And this has given me a great head start. So thank you so much. It's been a great experience.
Well, thank you to all of you for the really in-depth and thoughtful research that you conducted while in DC, and to everyone for joining us today. If these presentations and this session has intrigued you and you would like to apply for the South Asia Program Visiting Fellowship, our applications for next year are going to be live in October, so please do look out for that. And please do check out the policy memos of all of our visiting fellows, which are available on the Stimson website. But with that, I thank you all. Have a good evening or morning, wherever you are. And thank you so much again for joining us.